All right, so today we're going to learn the converse of the Pythagorean theorem. So we learned of the Pythagorean theorem yesterday and used it to solve several problems. And so the converse of the Pythagorean theorem is very close to the Pythagorean theorem and uses the Pythagorean theorem. It's just kind of in the reverse order. So let's go ahead and get started. So let's take a look at this triangle. If we have a triangle that looks like this, and we have one leg that is 6 inches long and one leg that is 8 inches long, and the angle formed between them is a right angle, then we know that the third side has to be 10 inches because 6, 8, and 10 form what is called a Pythagorean triple. That means that 6 squared plus 8 squared is equal to 10 squared. And so we know that 6 squared is 36, 8 squared is 64, and 10 squared is 100. And 36 plus 64 does indeed equal 100. So if a squared plus b squared equals c squared, then we know it has to be a right triangle. Okay? And so if the third side is 10, then it has to be a right triangle. So the reason we know that is because one of the things in the converse of the Pythagorean theorem is this statement right here. If a squared plus b squared equals c squared, then ABC has to be a right triangle. Well, what happens if it's not a right triangle? Let's take a look at this situation. Here we have an obtuse triangle because this angle is bigger than a right angle. And so if we look at what's happening here, if we take 6 squared plus 8 squared, that's not going to be equal to 12 squared. Notice this side here got bigger because it was stretched further than the right angle. And so that's not going to be equal to 12 squared. I believe 6 squared plus 8 squared, the 12 squared is going to be bigger. And so if we have 36, which is 6 squared, 8 squared is 64, that equals 100, but 12 squared is 144. So if the third side, if the hypotenuse side, if the biggest side squared is bigger than the sum of the two smaller sides squared, then it is an obtuse triangle. So in words, it would look like this. If the third side is bigger than the two, if the third side is bigger than 10, then it has to be an obtuse triangle. And so if a squared plus b squared is bigger than, should be the other way around, is less than c squared, okay? Or if c squared is bigger than the sum of the two smaller ones, a and b are the smallest two sides, and c is the biggest one. If the c squared is bigger than the sum of the two smaller ones, then it has to be an obtuse triangle. If we look at this, now the angle is an acute angle. It's an acute triangle, which means that 6 squared plus 8 squared and 9 squared, they're not equal to each other because it's not a right triangle. But 6 squared is 36, and 8 squared is 64, and 9 squared is 81. Well, 36 plus 64 is 100, which is greater than 81. So if a squared plus b squared is greater than the third side, then it's going to be an acute triangle. So if the third side is smaller than 10, then it has to be an acute triangle. And we have this statement, which should, I wrote this backwards, it should look like this. If a squared plus b squared is bigger than the biggest side squared, then it is an acute triangle. So what does this mean for something like this? A couple examples. The first example is this. We have a triangle with 3 sides. Okay, so we have a triangle with a w, an x, and a y. And they say that wx is 5 and xy is 12 and yw is 13. So I'm going to take the two smallest sides, which is 5 and 12, and square those and add them together and see how does that compare to the biggest side squared. Well, 5 squared is 25 and 12 squared is 144 and 13 squared is 169. But 25 plus 144 equals 169. So if it's equal to each other, then it has to be a right triangle. So we are going to conclude that WXY is a right triangle. On the other hand, if we look at something like this, here we have the smallest two sides are 8 and 12. So if I take 8 squared plus 12 squared, that's 12 squared, and we compare that to 15 squared, well, 8 squared is 64 and 12 squared is 144. If I add those two together, that's going to be 208. However, if I take 15 and I square that, that's 215. I think it's 215 or 225, one of the two. But that's bigger than the sum of the two smaller sides. So if this side is bigger than the two smaller sides, that means this has to be an obtuse angle or an obtuse triangle, because the biggest side is even bigger, meaning that the right angle opens up and becomes bigger, which means that side gets longer, and it's an obtuse triangle. So LMN would be an obtuse triangle. That's what assignment 6.5 is about, which is what our assignment is for today. There is an assignment on this in Math Excel that you can work on, and we will see you next time in class.